sometimes you get hit by a hardship and you think, this is the hardest it's ever going to get. And then something else happens, and something else happens, and something else happens, and something else happens. And so the idea of it all falling apart. And of course, the way that we come in to the way that we then age and the way that things start to wither away, we lose our appetite for this dunya, and it just seems to sometimes fall apart. And of course, that's true also in the collective sense with trials and tribulations. They start to strike one after the other, to where you feel like you can't catch up. On an individual level, you get hit and you think, this really hurts. And I think that this is the hardest it's going to get. And then something else happens. You look to the world, and if you are an empath, the believer sees a person falling off of a plane in Afghanistan or off of a boat from Libya. And where does my heart go to? How can I encompass all of this? May Allah make it easy for all of our brothers and sisters wherever they may be. So Jannah keeps getting better. Dunya, seemingly at least, seems to keep getting worse. And one of the things that happens to us is that sometimes it's also our perception that when one trial hits, we read into things that aren't necessarily trials as being trials after that, or we magnify our trials. You know, it's like if someone is in a boxing ring and they get hit and they say, you know, you can tell that the fighter was never the same for the rest of the fight, even if they managed to get back up and they managed to recover, but the effect of that hit was there. And so sometimes what happens after a major trial hits you in life, you start reading into it way more than what should be read into it, and it's like, Ya Allah, why is it all falling apart? What's happening? Why do the punches keep on coming? Now what I want to talk about is that lowest point, because undoubtedly there is a point that all of us will reach that will be our lowest point. And it doesn't necessarily need to be our lowest point in terms of the severity of the tragedy. It could be the circumstances that we are in when that happens. Surely Ta'if, which we know was the lowest point of the Prophet ﷺ because he said so. Ta'if hurt more because the Prophet ﷺ did not have Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha to wipe his wounds. There's no doubt about that. There is also a decade of rejection that precedes Ta'if that makes it that much worse. And so sometimes, and that's why every trial is unique, it's the circumstances around, it hits you at the wrong time, and wrong in quotation marks, wrong time, and it's like, Ya Allah, this is horrible. I don't know how to get out of this. I don't know how to move forward. And of course, certain trials also have a permanence in regards to the consequences in life. You lose someone you love, as much as you cope, that person will not come back to this earth. Something falls apart, sometimes there's a permanence to that. Now what do we do? And I don't want to just talk about this from the perspective of hardship as a whole. I want to talk about that lowest point and how you actually take that and do something with it that's very unique. Because when you're at that lowest point, you know what else you are? You're most vulnerable. You're most vulnerable in that you're most likely to put your ego to the side and you can humble yourself most to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you're most vulnerable, which has the capacity to reinvigorate your dua, your prayer, your reflection, your worship. Sometimes you see a relationship and they say the best thing that ever happened to that relationship was that it hit crisis. And out of that crisis, we learn things, certain things happen, and you look back at that and you see that was a turning point. So your ego gets put to the side. You're humbled. And when you're humbled, you're in a perfect place to make sujood and to cry out to Allah in prostration and say, Ya Allah, I'm humbled. You're also in that vulnerability in a perfect place to rethink things, to be introspective, to actually start to think about what preceded that moment and what can be done after that moment. So it's an interesting place that you find yourself in. And you have to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't give you a swamp. Allah gives you a springboard. When you're in that low point, you have a chance to jump up. There is no fall that any of us will ever encounter than the literal fall of Adam alayhi salam from paradise to earth. But even then, there was an elevation in his station, his maqam, his status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that made his station even greater than before he fell. The same thing with Yunus alayhi salam plunging to the bottom of the ocean. That's a fall that none of us could probably quite come to terms with. But you're in this place where you can rethink. You're in this place where you can reevaluate, reassess, and then get back somewhere. or where you've actually never been, and let it be an actual better place. And the reality is that a lot of times, especially when you're talking about the secular sense, when someone hits that low point, they talk about their potential from that downfall in this world. It's restricted to this world. That's the problem with a dunyawi dunya, a worldly worldview. It's so restrictive. It's so limited. What's the maximum they could talk about? Your potential coming out of that. And certainly, that's part of it, that there's a certain potential of strength and resilience that can be gained from that place. But when we think about it, we think about it also in terms of the potential of a higher place in paradise, the potential of a higher station with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're taught not to necessarily wish for the low point to achieve that potential.